Welcome back, everyone. I am Dr. Maris Contreras, and I will be moderating this session today. Before we get started, we have a quick poll question for you. Please view the poll question on the screen, and in a moment, it will also pop up for you to vote on. So the question reads, if your organization could begin creating a PC-CIS tomorrow, for what purpose will you most need to use a PC-CIS? And we're starting to see some answers coming up so far. We'll give it a couple more seconds here. It seems that we have inform core outcome set development and develop a clinic outcome assessment are the most popular answers. We have a couple last minute polls, so we just leave it for another 10 seconds or so, and then we'll get going. Great. Thank you everyone for participating on the poll today. And thank you also, Eleanor and Suze, for that thoughtful and engaging conversation. I think we had some really great, productive, and insightful questions in the previous session. So I'm just very pleased with how this is very received. I am now excited to again introduce Ms. Annie Kennedy, Chief of Policy Advocacy and Patient Engagement at the Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases, and Dr. Leonard Valentino, President and Chief Executive Officer at the National Hemophilia Foundation. They're also the co-chairs for this dialogue meeting. So to give you a brief background, on July 19th, the National Health Council held a virtual discussion and listening session with members of the patient community. 9 patient advocacy groups and 1 individual patient participated. It was a valuable and insightful discussion. So Annie and Len, before we jump into our moderating questions, can you just take a moment to describe for us your reactions or take on the patient group listening sessions that you attended? So Len, I will start with you first, and then we'll pass it on to Annie. Len?
Yeah, thanks, Omar. You know, the listening sessions were really very insightful. Having been part of the process for many, many months and having in-depth discussions, it was really great to see the reflections and hear those reflections from outside participants who were now able to see this blueprint, what the components were. But what I was most excited about was to really hear their comments about challenges, the potential barriers that might exist. But it was really very exciting to see, sort of the comments that they had moving forward and how excited people were to be able to engage around the blueprint process.
Mm-hmm. Annie.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think one of the things that strikes me is that we really are talking about a diversity of types of patient communities and patient advocacy organizations when we think about the development of the PC-CIS tools and the blueprint. And even the last question and answer session, I think, really reflected that you have some organizations that have already amassed quite an amount of data and have been in this PFDD space for quite some time. And then you have some organizations that are just getting started in the space or trying to figure out how to even build the capacity to endeavor to start this work. And there are real resource barriers to doing that. And there are real barriers on both ends of that spectrum. And so I do think that we need to be mindful that whatever we create has to solve for the barriers for all of those communities and those groups. And this really needs to be a fit for purpose tool And so I think as we think about what we heard in those sessions and as we have the discussions today, we really are trying to create something that serves the broader community and that people can pull down into their respective patient communities and disease spaces.
So adding to that, Annie, could you comment on what you think is the most important strength of a patient-centered core impact set, and more specifically, the blueprint and how to develop them?
Sure. I'd actually say two things to that end. I'd say the strength is that it begins with patients and is driven by patients. I think that the methodology that's been used from the very beginning and time again is it's working to reduce any historical bias, whether in so many, and there's so much great data out there about our respective disease spaces and our patient communities, but historically a lot of that data is generated and comes through the lens of clinicians that have interpreted what matters to patients and what patients are experiencing. And this whole endeavor acknowledges that we've been operating in that system for a very long time, and that we need to start with the patient and the caregiver and understand what is valued as clinically meaningful and meaningful beyond the clinic for patients. So I think that's first and foremost. I think one of the other things to that end that really is important is it good enough tool that continuously checks us to understand the timeliness and the representativeness of what we're measuring. And I think, again, that came up in that Q&A because diseases change, natural history changes, the ecosystem, the context in which we live changes and changes our experience. So that's the other thing. And then the other thing I would say is that PC-CIS is upstream. And so everything else all throughout the stream can stem from this. And again, that sort of came resonating through all the tools and the discussions, and even in that poll that we started with today, the way everybody answered, so many people here today are looking to utilize this differently depending on where we are in our pipelines or what part of the ecosystem we're working with. But we all need this. We all need to center ourselves in what our patient communities value as impactful.
Great. And I think it goes back to Eleanor's point earlier about how every representative, whether it's a patient advocacy group, whether it's pharmaceutical device company, or any other entity that is wanting to use the PC-CIS, it could be targeted and tailored towards, each representative who are using this. So I think that's a valuable point. And not forgetting that patient is first, and the voice of the patient matters when we are trying to implement these initiatives forward. So Len, let me turn to you. So what would you comment that some of the strengths of the blueprint is, or a core impact set would be?
Well, I would echo what Annie emphasized first, is that it starts with patients, and patients are important and continue to have a voice throughout the entire process. I think one of the other strengths clearly is that it's a blueprint. It's a step-by-step process that is articulated, that is easy to follow. And I think, it relates to the comment about small organizations, big organizations. When you have that type of step-by-step process, it makes it somewhat easier for even small organizations who don't have large staffs to be able to engage in something like this. I think the sort of what I would consider the surround sound to the blueprint, the toolbox, the checklists, the video, I think all of those are going to be incredibly important for those types of organizations, no matter what their size, because those are going to be really important components that could be utilized and will, number one, avoid duplication. That was something that we heard, during the session with other stakeholders about the potential for duplication. I think this process will avoid duplication, but more importantly, it can be adjusted, as you said, to the community and the size of the organization. So I think it's something, although, the outcomes might be different in different regions of the world, different disease states, I think the blueprint still provides a basis to start. And it might require some adjustments in a different disease state or a different global region, but it's still a place to start. And I think that's what, these patient communities need, is a reference point, a starting point to work from. So the strength for me is easy to follow, lots of tools and ancillary support that's in there, and it's adjustable.
Mhm, mhm. Great points from both of you. As we also understand that health equity has become a priority for many of us, and not just in recent times, but for a long time, health equity has been at the center of all of our initiatives. So we heard during the listening session that this blueprint is specifically important now in an era that puts greater focus on the social determinants of health. Is that something that resonates with you? So let's start with Annie.
It absolutely does. So another endeavor that we've worked on recently at the Everlife Foundation is the National Economic Burden of Rare Disease Study. And one of the things that we're finding and digging into in some of that data is that barriers to care and access and diagnosis are measured differently, not by years, but sometimes decades, depending on your demographic. And so most definitely, if we don't begin to quantify that, we worry a lot about clinical trial engagement and enrollment, but we haven't even diagnosed members of our community, let alone provided access to care, enrolled people in clinical trials, or thought about access to therapeutics. So the ability to start to pull that into this blueprint and think about how that impacts what people value as far as their lived experience of their disease is critically important.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Len, representing an organization, a patient organization with blood disorder, how would you see the social determinants of health be incorporated into this blueprint that could help an organization like yours?
Yeah, it's a great question, Omar. So, again, I think the social context that we all have operated in has been impacting our communities for decades. I think only recently has this, maybe in the last decade or so, really coming to the forefront as such an important component, and certainly through the pandemic, this has really become highlighted. And I think applying a health equity lens to this blueprint is critically important. So, for example, in our organization, the National Hemophilia Foundation, we just held the inaugural Health Equity Summit. And it was an opportunity to bring stakeholders together to really talk about what was important to them. And I think the fear is that we will listen to ourselves and talk to ourselves and not engage all aspects of the community. And that was one of the real learnings that we had from our summit, was we need to work harder to pull in populations that typically don't get a voice and typically don't have a seat at the table. And I think this is a process that we can take time and ensure that we have the right people, and not just the same people providing input on a regular basis, that we're really going for populations of individuals who don't normally get a say in what their outcomes are, what our outcomes are important to them. So I do think that having this health equity lens is critically important. We just completed a literature review that we published on what's available in social determinants of health. And we've actually decided to call this social drivers of health, because determinants are something that may be predetermined and you can't change, where drivers are something that we can impact. I see this type of PC-CIS as something that can truly impact the social drivers of health, but they need to be incorporated in a thoughtful and meaningful way from the beginning. And that can only happen by engaging people who traditionally have not been engaged in the past.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Dr. Valentino, you also hit hit it right on the nail. It is the National Council's effort that our next steps is for PC-CIS to also really take a look at the health equity perspective and the health, and the equity lens for PC-CIS. We definitely are committed to improving the health of patients, and this is something that is on top of our mind and priority, definitely, as we also foresee, what are the next steps. You also mentioned, and I'll go first with Len before I jump on with Annie. You mentioned about, shortage of staff, and potentially that could be an impact in terms of how an organization, or at least a patient group organization, may have challenge in implementing a PC-CIS. So could you comment a little bit more on what you think is the most important challenge that you see patient groups when it comes to being able to use the blueprint to create their own PC-CIS?
Yeah, I think the greatest challenge is, what I would consider sort of the, quivering in the corner and not knowing where to go, and feeling like you can't take the first step. So the blueprint really gives you an opportunity to take the first step. It gives you a structure, a framework, truly a blueprint that can guide you, hold your hand step by step. And I think that's what any organization really needs, is the confidence that they're moving in the right direction, taking the right first steps. And that's irrespective of what size your organization is, because you don't want to have certainly loss of time, wasted capital, whether it's human capital or financial capital, on an effort that's not going to be fruitful. So I think the blueprint allows you to take sound, well thought out steps that are demonstrated to get you in the right direction and move you in the right way. So I think that's probably what is really most important to me, allows any organization to really start moving in the right direction.
Annie?
Well, first of all, I totally agree with Len on that. I think the other thing that's always a challenge for patient organizations in this type of work, anytime we're talking about work in the patient-focused drug development space and collecting patient experience data, is that most patient organizations, or I would say the majority of patient organizations, were established with the goal of discovering treatments and cures for the diseases that their patient communities are affected by. Mm-hmm. And many were established by families living with those conditions. And many are fueled by the patient community. And so creating a value proposition for this type of work is often very challenging for staff within the organizations, because at the end of the day, funds are incredibly limited. And what we ultimately want to be funding is research and therapy development, because that's how we get to the end game most directly. That's what looks like the direct line. And so in my experience, when I've worked for those patient advocacy organizations, while establishing an ICD code or doing work around patient-focused drug development and doing the social science work was incredibly important, and we all understood why that was necessary and would inform decision-making, it was much more difficult to explain to our board or our investors or our families that were raising the money why we needed to do it. And so I do think one of the things that will be important for us within this effort is to help create that value proposition and explain why doing this really important but very onerous upstream work will help inform so many efforts throughout the ecosystems. Mm-hmm. And why investing in this early and often, because it's not a point in time endeavor, will at the end of the day maybe de-risk work with clinical trialists and researchers and clinicians and industry. But I think we have to build that value proposition, and whether that's through a whiteboard video or some simple tools that we can package for organizations, but we have to help do that, because that's actually critically important. And that is a really important barrier that organizations have to overcome internally in order to even start to do this work.
Mm-hmm. And those are some of the questions, that we've been asked by, by patient advocacy groups about these challenges and how do they overcome. So I think some of the insights that you both have provided have been very helpful. Before we move on to the next question, I do want to remind our attendees that you could also ask questions to our panelists on the Q&A option at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So please make sure to do so if you have any questions for them. The blueprint emphasizes leadership from the patient community, as we heard before, and in all of the development for PC-CIS. So what are your thoughts on how that enhances the blueprint? And we talked a little bit more about how the patient needs to be, at the core center, but how does the leadership component adds to the value of the blueprint? So I'll start with Annie first.
Well, that's the buy-in right there, right? That's the rub. Not to cut short. Mm-hmm. If you want to talk about what's impactful and meaningful to patients, you have to have the patient community, and more importantly, those that are trusted entities within the patient community at the core of this effort. I've always said that one of the superpowers of a patient community is the power to convene. And so I think Eleanor and Susan in the last session talked about this isn't intended to be driven only by the patient community. It's intended to be started by the patient community, bringing people together. But the patient community is going to be sort of that trusted entity that's going to help drive, know who to bring together, convene, whether it's federal agency partners, industry partners, other stakeholders in the system, bringing us all together. So I think that is first and foremost the most important element of this, because our patient communities look to us to understand what data collection sources are worthwhile and worthy of their time at the end of the day when you have very limited time and bandwidth to participate in something.
Mm-hmm. Len, what are your thoughts on emphasizing leadership?
Yeah, Annie used the word that I embrace and use very frequently, which is convene. I see our organizations as conveners. We represent the voice of the patient. And no matter how an industry partner or a federal partner tries to capture that voice of the patient, it's always through the patient's lens, through the patient organization, that really comes most strongly and most authentically to represent what's really important to the people who live with these diseases. And no matter how an industry partner tries to capture that, it really needs to be the leadership of the patient organization, and more importantly, the patients who are part of those organizations. I'm a physician. I'm not a patient who lives with hemophilia or a blood disorder. I represent them, but I need to put patients who live with these disorders on a daily basis in front of an industry partner, in front of a federal partner, in front of a payer, to really tell their story about what it is to live with a blood disorder. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the leadership that patient organizations can bring, but more importantly, the importance that a patient who lives with these disorders brings. And that's why the blueprint is so important, because I think it does emphasize that sort of red thread that's woven through the entire blueprint of the patient voice and the importance of the patient throughout the entire process.
Thank you. And we're coming up close here to wrapping up. But again, from a patient group perspective, are there any final comments and thoughts on the blueprint before we close? So Annie?
Yeah, I would say two things. I think, first of all, we have a branding opportunity. So I think calling it the PC-CIS, maybe it could be improved on. So I'll just kick that out. The second, though, is that in this whole ecosystem of patient experience data, I think it's really important that we understand how and when anything's going to be utilized. And it's really important to get a signal from the stakeholders who we ultimately want to see utilizing the tools, the resources, and the data we're collecting, that it's going to be utilized in their spaces and in their reviews and in their decision making. So I'm really grateful to see a lot of different stakeholder panels here today, but I do think that's an important consideration. So an example is the patient experience data checklist at the FDA. It was really important to our patient communities that that exist, because it was important for the continued investment in the development of patient experience data, that we knew that FDA reviewers were going to look at patient experience data. Similarly, I would sort of say to other stakeholders, and we keep listing where in that downstream we want to see this data utilized and the blueprint utilized, that we would want to understand how this will be utilized, whether it will be utilized, because we're talking about an investment of time and infrastructure on the part of especially patient communities to develop all of this. So in tandem with these conversations, I think it's really important that we understand, when we know the quality and the quantity of the data collection is strong, how would this data be utilized?
Mm-hmm. And Len, any final thoughts before we wrap up and go for our break?
Yeah, I think my final thought is that everybody who's on this call and everybody who listens to this, post hoc, needs to feel empowered and needs to feel that they have the ability to move forward, to develop a patient-centered core impact set, no matter what it ends up being called. But I think that the utilizing the blueprint is now what's most critical. We need more of those use cases. We need more demonstration projects to be able to show the value of this blueprint and how it can really impact the lives of people who live with these diseases. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I think this is a great start, and it's certainly not anywhere close to being finished. We've got a lot of work in front of us to be able to really now start to generate these core impact sets.
Well, thank you so much, Annie and Len. Thank you so much for just this insightful and wonderful conversation on the patient group perspective. So I only just look also forward to the next sessions that we have coming in our dialogue today.